The desert stretched endlessly, in every direction. A sea of sand and heat shimmer that distorted the horizon into liquid waves of ochre and gold. Major Alexei Volkov sat in the commander's cupola of his T-72 main battle tank, watching the sun climb toward its midday zenith, feeling the metal around him already beginning to radiate the kind of heat that could cook a man alive if he wasn't careful. It was August 1991, somewhere in the Iraqi desert north of Basra, and the world was on the edge of something that nobody quite wanted to name, but everyone could feel coming like a storm gathering on a clear day. Alexei was 34 years old, a veteran of Afghanistan, where he had learned that combat was less about glory and more about survival, less about tactics from textbooks and more about split-second decisions made with incomplete information and consequences that lasted forever. He had commanded tanks for 12 years, had trained on the T-72 until he knew every gauge and lever and quirk of the machine, had come to trust it the way a pilot trusts his aircraft or a sailor trusts his ship. The T-72 was Soviet engineering at its finest, or so they had been told. Reliable, powerful, capable of going toe-to-toe with any Western tank and emerging victorious. The instructors at the Tank Academy had drilled this into them with the fervor of religious conviction, and Alexei had believed it because belief was easier than doubt, and doubt could get you killed. His crew consisted of 3 other men who had become closer to him than brothers over the years of training and deployment. There was Sergeant Dmitry Kasparov, the gunner, a quiet man from Minsk, who could put a sailboat round through a target at 2,000 meters with the precision of a surgeon. There was Corporal Ivan Petrov, the driver, young and quick, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes after what he had seen in the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. And there was Private Yuri Sokolov, the loader, barely 21 years old, who wrote letters to his mother every week and kept a photograph of his girlfriend tucked into his helmet liner. They were part of a tank company that had been deployed to Iraq as advisors and trainers, teaching Iraqi tank crews how to operate Soviet equipment, how to maintain it, how to fight with it. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, safe and far from any real conflict, a way to project Soviet influence in the Middle East without directly engaging in combat. But the world had a way of making liars out of planners, and what was supposed to be routine had become increasingly tense as American forces built up in Saudi Arabia, and the rhetoric from both sides grew sharper with each passing day. Alexei had seen the American tanks during reconnaissance patrols, the M1 Abrams with their distinctive turbine engines and modern angular armor. They looked impressive, he admitted that privately, but impressive and effective were different things. The T-72 had proven itself in combat, had been tested in the brutal conditions of Afghanistan, and emerged with a reputation for toughness and reliability. The Abrams was newer, more expensive, built with technology that the Americans bragged about endlessly. But Alexei had learned not to trust propaganda from either side. What mattered was what happened when the shooting started, and he had confidence in his tank, in his crew, in the training that had been beaten into them through thousands of hours of drills and exercises. The radio crackled to life in his headset, the voice of Captain Zaitsev, the company commander, terse and controlled. All units, movement detected on western approach. American reconnaissance force, estimated 4 vehicles. Hold position and prepare for possible engagement. Do not fire unless fired upon. Acknowledge. Alexei keyed his microphone. Hunter 2-1 acknowledges. Holding position. He felt his heart rate increase slightly, felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before combat. The body preparing itself for action, even as the mind tried to stay calm and analytical. He switched to the crew intercom. Did you hear that? Americans coming our way. Stay sharp, but stay calm. This might be nothing. Dimitri's voice came back, steady as always. Sights are on. Ready when you are, Major. Ivan chimed in from the driver's seat. Engine running smooth. I can get us out of here fast if needed. Yuri said nothing, but Alexei heard the metallic click of a round being loaded into the breech, the private doing his job without needing to be told. Good crew, Alexei thought. The best he had ever commanded. Through his binoculars, Alexei scanned the western horizon, looking for dust plumes or the glint of metal, anything that would reveal the approaching Americans. The heat shimmer made it difficult, turned the landscape into a wavering mirage, where solid objects seemed to dance and dissolve. Then he saw them, 4 shapes emerging from the distortion, moving with the confident speed of vehicles that knew they owned the battlefield. M1 Abrams tanks. He recognized the silhouette immediately, their turbine engines creating a distinctive sound that carried across the desert like distant thunder. They were magnificent machines, he had to admit that. Larger than the T-72, more modern in every visible way, with composite armor that the Americans claimed could withstand anything the Soviets could throw at it. Alexei felt a flicker of uncertainty, quickly suppressed. The T-72 had its own advantages, he reminded himself. Lower profile, faster reload time in experienced hands, and the 125mm main gun that could punch through most armor at combat ranges. Numbers and specifications were one thing, but combat was about crews and training, and who made the first critical mistake. The American tanks halted at about 3,000 meters, just at the edge of effective engagement range, and for several minutes, nothing happened. 2 forces watching each other across the desert, each waiting to see what the other would do, the tension building with every second of silence. Alexei's hand rested on the commander's override, ready to traverse the turret and engage if the situation demanded it, but hoping with everything in him that it wouldn't come to that. Then Captain Zaitsev's voice came through again, and there was something different in his tone, something that made Alexei's stomach drop. All units, stand by. American force is being reinforced. Count now 12 vehicles. We are outnumbered. Hold position, but be ready to displace on my command. Alexei raised his binoculars again and felt cold certainty settle over him, despite the desert heat. More Abrams tanks were arriving, spreading out into a combat formation that spoke of professional training and tactical competence. 12 against 6, 2-to-1 odds, and the Americans had the advantage of newer equipment and better battlefield awareness systems. This was no longer a reconnaissance probe. This was the beginning of something larger, something that was going to change everything. The radio traffic increased, officers at higher command levels trying to figure out what was happening, whether this was a local incident or the start of a broader engagement, whether to order a withdrawal or to hold position and assert their presence. Alexei listened to the confusion and indecision with growing frustration, knowing that every minute spent talking was a minute that let the Americans improve their position and bring up more reinforcements. The decision was taken out of their hands when the first American tank fired, a ranging shot that kicked up sand 200 meters short of the Russian position. It wasn't meant to hit, Alexei realized. It was a statement, a warning, a way of saying that the Americans were ready to fight if the Russians were stupid enough to push it. The message was received and understood, but the response was already determined by pride and politics, and the fact that backing down would be seen as weakness by commanders who were sitting in air-conditioned headquarters hundreds of miles away. Captain Zaitsev's voice came through, tight with controlled tension. All units, prepare to engage. Target the lead vehicles. Fire on my command. Alexei felt the world narrow to the crosshairs in his gun sight, to the laser rangefinder reading off distance and wind correction, to the familiar rhythm of combat preparation that he had practiced 10,000 times. Dmitri, target the lead Abrams. Sabot round. Identified. Sabot loaded. Dmitri's voice was calm, professional. The voice of a man doing a job he knew how to do. Range, 2,800 meters. Wind, negligible. Fire, when ready. The T-72 rocked as the main gun fired, the 125mm cannon, sending a depleted uranium penetrator downrange at nearly a mile per second. Alexei watched through his sight, saw the round impact the lead Abrams, saw the flash of metal on metal, and then saw something that made his blood run cold. The Abrams barely reacted. The round that should have penetrated the armor should have turned the interior into a hell of shrapnel and spalling, had simply bounced off, deflected by composite armor that was doing exactly what the Americans had claimed it could do. Before he could process this, before he could order a second shot, the American tank fired back. The incoming round was faster than anything Alexei had expected, and it struck the T-72 to his left, with devastating effect. The tank exploded, not just caught fire, but actually exploded, the turret lifting off the chassis in a geyser of flame and smoke, rising 20 feet into the air before crashing back down. 3 men dead in an instant. 3 men he had trained with and drank with and called friends, simply gone in a flash of light and thunder. "Reverse! Driver, reverse now!" Alexei was shouting, his professional calm shattered by the realization that they were catastrophically outmatched. The T-72's diesel engine roared as Ivan threw the tank into reverse, trying to get them behind the cover of a sand dune, trying to break the line of sight with the Americans, who were systematically destroying the Russian position with a precision that spoke of technological superiority and training that exceeded anything Alexei had encountered. Another T-72 exploded to his right, the turret flying off in the same characteristic way, and Alexei understood with horrible clarity what was happening. The American tanks were using some kind of advanced ammunition, some kind of round that could penetrate the T-72's armor, like it was paper. And more than that, they were hitting the ammunition storage in the carousel loader at the base of the turret, causing catastrophic explosions that gave the crews no chance of survival. Target left. Dmitri was trying to get a shot off, trying to do something, anything. But the Americans were moving now, their turbine engines allowing them to accelerate and maneuver with a speed that the diesel-powered T-72 couldn't match. They were using the terrain, using their superior optics and fire control systems, engaging from positions where they could see the Russian tanks, but the Russian tanks struggled to see them. Alexei's tank shuddered as a round struck the front armor, penetrating but not causing the catastrophic explosion that had killed the other crews. They were still alive, but the tank was dying, smoke filling the interior, alarms screaming, the smell of burning rubber and electrical insulation making it hard to breathe. "Bail out! Everybody out now!" He grabbed Yuri and physically threw him out of the commander's hatch. Saw Ivan scrambling out of the driver's position. Saw Dmitri emerging from the turret. All of them hitting the sand and running, putting distance between themselves and the tank that might still explode at any second. They made it 50 meters before the ammunition cooked off, and the T-72 joined its companions as burning wreckage decorating the desert floor. Alexei lay in the sand, gasping for air, his ears ringing from the explosions, watching the American tanks continue their advance. The entire engagement had lasted less than 4 minutes from first shot to complete destruction of the Russian tank company. 6 T-72 seconds. Experienced crews, positioned in defensive terrain, simply swept aside by a smaller force of American tanks that had proven themselves superior in every measurable way. He heard Yuri crying, the young private curled into a ball, hands over his head, repeating his girlfriend's name like a prayer. He heard Ivan cursing in a steady stream, obscenities mixed with disbelief. He heard Dmitri saying nothing, just breathing hard, staring at the burning wrecks of their tanks with eyes that had seen too much and understood too well. Captain Zaitsev's voice came through on Alexei's personal radio, the man having survived by pure luck, his tank positioned behind a dune that had shielded him from the initial engagement. "All survivors, rally on my position. We're withdrawing. This fight is over." The withdrawal turned into a rout as more American tanks appeared, as attack helicopters joined the battle, as the technological superiority that the West had been building for decades revealed itself in a demonstration so one-sided it bordered on massacre. The Iraqis, who had been watching from their own positions, began to abandon their vehicles and flee on foot, having seen what happened when Soviet equipment met American firepower and wanting no part of it. Alexei and his crew made it back to friendly lines 3 hours later, exhausted, and traumatized, their uniforms blackened with smoke, their faces showing the 1,000-yard stare that came from watching your entire worldview collapse in the space of a few minutes. They were debriefed by intelligence officers who asked endless questions about the American tanks, about their capabilities, about their tactics, and Alexei answered truthfully, even though every word felt like admitting defeat. The T-72 that they had trusted, that they had believed in, had been utterly outclassed. The American tanks were faster, better armored, equipped with thermal sights that could see through smoke and dust, armed with ammunition that could penetrate Russian armor from angles and distances that should have been impossible. The engagement hadn't been a battle. It had been a technological demonstration, a preview of what would happen if the Cold War ever turned hot. And the preview showed, with brutal clarity, that the Soviet Union had fallen behind in the arms race in ways that propaganda and national pride had hidden. That night, sitting in a tent drinking vodka with his surviving crew, Alexei tried to process what had happened. Yuri was still shaking, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold his cup. Ivan was quiet. All his earlier bravado burned away in the desert. Dmitri just stared into the distance, occasionally shaking his head as if trying to deny what his eyes had seen. They said the T-72 was invincible, Yuri said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. They said we could beat any Western tank. They said our armor, our gun, our training, all of it was superior. They lied to us. Alexei wanted to contradict him, wanted to find words of encouragement or explanation, but he had none. The young private was right. They had been lied to, not maliciously perhaps, but lied to nonetheless, by a system that valued national pride over honest assessment, that had convinced itself that quantity could overcome quality, that had failed to keep pace with Western technological advancement, and then hidden that failure behind rhetoric and secrecy. The Abrams hit us from 2,800 meters, Dmitri said, his analyst's mind working through the problem even in shock. Our effective range with the T-72 is maybe 2,000 meters against modern armor, and even then, only with perfect conditions. They could see us through their thermal sights when we could barely see them through conventional optics. They could hit us while moving. Their stabilization systems are that good, and their armor, their composite armor, it just shrugged off our sabot rounds like they were nothing. How many did we destroy? Ivan asked. How many of them did we take down? The silence that followed was answer enough. None. Not a single American tank had been destroyed or even seriously damaged. It had been completely one-sided, a turkey shoot, the kind of engagement that military historians would study as an example of technological disparity, deciding battles before the first shot was even fired. Alexei thought about the American tank commanders, wondered what they were thinking right now, wondered if they had felt any fear at all, or if they had known from the beginning that the outcome was never in doubt. He thought about the propaganda films he had watched, the ones showing T-72 seconds dominating battlefields, destroying enemy armor with ease. All lies, or at best, carefully staged demonstrations against obsolete targets that bore no resemblance to modern Western equipment. The Soviet Union collapsed 4 months later, the economic and political pressures finally overwhelming a system that could no longer sustain itself. Alexei liked to think that the tank battle in the desert had nothing to do with that collapse, that it was just one small incident in a much larger story. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he wondered if maybe it had mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. If the realization that Soviet military power was a paper tiger, that the mighty Red Army couldn't even protect its clients and allies from Western intervention, had accelerated the loss of faith that brought the whole system down. He left the military 6 months after the engagement, took his discharge papers and went home to Moscow to find a city that was changing so fast it barely resembled the place he remembered. He found work as a mechanic, using the skills he had learned, maintaining tanks to repair civilian vehicles, and he tried not to think about the desert, or the burning T-72 seconds, or the 4 minutes that had changed everything he thought he knew. Yuri never recovered from the trauma. He went home to his girlfriend, married her, and tried to build a normal life, But the nightmares never stopped, and the shaking in his hands never went away. He killed himself 3 years later, alone in his apartment, leaving a note that said simply that he was tired of being afraid. Alexei went to the funeral and stood in the cold Moscow rain and thought about how war killed people in many different ways, some fast and some slow, but all of them permanent. Ivan became a taxi driver in St. Petersburg, navigating the chaotic post-Soviet streets with the same quick reflexes that had once made him an excellent tank driver. Alexei saw him once, years later, and they had coffee and talked about everything except the desert, except the tanks, except the day their faith in Soviet invincibility died along with their friends. Dmitry joined a private security company and ended up working in Africa, protecting oil installations and corporate executives, putting his military skills to use in the new capitalist Russia. He sent Alexei emails occasionally, brief messages that never mentioned the past, always focused on the future, as if by looking forward he could somehow leave behind what had happened in that Iraqi desert. And Alexei tried to move on, tried to build a life, tried to forget, but certain things stayed with him no matter how many years passed. The sound of the T-72's turret exploding, the smell of burning diesel and human flesh, the sight of the American tanks advancing through the smoke with the inexorable confidence of superior technology. The realization that everything he had been taught, everything he had believed in, had been based on comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths. Military historians would later study the engagement, would write papers about the technological gap between Eastern and Western armor, would use it as a case study in how equipment superiority could overcome numerical and positional advantages. They would analyze the ballistics, the armor composition, the fire control systems, reducing the battle to equations and graphs and PowerPoint presentations. But they would never capture what it felt like to sit in a T-72 and watch your rounds bounce off enemy armor while knowing that the next incoming shot would likely kill you and everyone you served with. They would never understand the feeling of betrayal that came from realizing your own side had sent you into battle with equipment they knew was inferior, with tactics they knew were outdated, with confidence they knew was unjustified. The T-72 went on to serve in dozens of armies around the world, upgraded and modified, still a capable tank when used properly against appropriate opposition. But for Alexei and the men who had trusted it against the Abrams, it would always be the tank that failed them when they needed it most, the symbol of a military-industrial complex that valued propaganda over performance. The machine that represented everything wrong with Soviet thinking in those final years before the collapse. He kept one memento from that day, a piece of armor plate from his destroyed T-72, scorched and twisted and penetrated by the American sabot round. He kept it in a drawer in his apartment, took it out sometimes late at night when the memories were particularly vivid, and ran his fingers over the hole that shouldn't have been there, that represented the gap between what they were told and what was real. And he thought about the American crews, wondered if they ever thought about that engagement, if it meant anything to them beyond a successful training exercise, a confirmation of their equipment's superiority. Probably not, he decided. For them it had been routine, expected, just another demonstration of American military might. They had gone in knowing they would win, and they had won exactly as predicted, and then they had moved on to the next objective without looking back. But for Alexei and his crew, for the Soviet tankers who had trusted the T-72 until that insane strike proved them catastrophically wrong, it had been the end of something fundamental. The end of belief in Soviet technological parity, the end of faith in the propaganda they had been fed since childhood, the end of the illusion that they were serving in a military that could stand toe-to-toe with the West and emerge victorious. The desert sun had revealed truths that the Moscow winter had kept frozen and hidden, and those truths, once seen, could never be unseen. The T-72 was not invincible. Soviet armor was not superior. The training and courage of Russian crews could not overcome fundamental disadvantages in equipment and technology. And the system that had sent them to fight with inferior weapons while telling them they were superior had been built on lies that were finally, inevitably, catastrophically collapsing under the weight of reality. Alexei Volkov lived another 40 years after that day in the desert, long enough to see the Soviet Union become a memory, long enough to see Russia struggle to find its place in a world where military power was measured in silicon chips and satellite networks rather than tank divisions and nuclear arsenals. He lived long enough to see a new generation of Russian tanks, more modern and capable, trying to close the gap that had been so brutally exposed in the Iraqi sand. But he never set foot in a tank again. Never wanted to. Never could bring himself to trust that kind of machine after it had failed him so completely. He died quietly in his sleep at the age of 74. And at his funeral, his daughter found the piece of armor plate in his belongings and asked what it was. Dmitri, old now and gray but still alive, told her it was a reminder, a piece of history, a fragment from the day when comfortable lies met uncomfortable truths, and the lies lost decisively. The T-72 seconds that burned in the desert that August day were eventually scrapped, cut up for metal, recycled into something useful. But the memory of what happened there, the impossible strike that proved Soviet tankers wrong about everything they thought they knew, that memory lived on, in the men who survived, and in the history books that recorded the encounter as a turning point in modern armored warfare, the day when the superiority of Western technology was demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt, leaving nothing behind but smoke and wreckage and shattered faith in machines that had promised invincibility but delivered only obsolescence and death.